I used to believe that families, mine especially, were woven from threads too strong to tear. Growing up, our house smelled of my mother's lavender soap and my father's pipe tobacco, scents that clung to the walls long after arguments cooled and apologies were spoken. To outsiders, we were a close-knit household, Sunday dinners, shared chores, and the kind of photo-ready smiles that suggested harmony rather than discipline. And yet, within all that domestic glow, there were shadows. Faint at first. Almost ignorable. My older brother, Daniel, was the kind of child adults praised and younger siblings envied. He had a talent for charming people, teachers, neighbors, even strangers who crossed his path. But underneath that honeyed charisma was something harder, colder. I learned early that Daniel's kindness was conditional, a tool he sharpened and used when it served him. Children see truths before they understand them, and my truth was simple: Daniel always took more than he gave. Even then, I sensed it. I just didn't understand how far it would one day go. When our parents passed, first my father after a sudden heart attack, then my mother years later in a quieter, lonelier way, the house that once held all our memories felt unfamiliar. The air grew still. Rooms echoed differently. Grief has a way of staining time, making days blur together in muted tones, but eventually, life began stitching itself back into something livable. I told myself, Daniel and I would manage the estate together. After all, grief softens people, or so I hoped. For a brief period, things appeared orderly. We divided responsibilities the way our parents would have wanted. I handled personal items, and Daniel took charge of legal paperwork. He insisted it was easier that way. I know the process, he'd say with a practiced smile. I didn't argue. I didn't want to. Losing our mother had hollowed out whatever strength I had, and trusting Daniel felt easier than questioning him. But calm, I would soon learn, can be one of the most deceptive sensations. It began with a missing document, nothing dramatic, just an absent page in a packet I'd been reviewing late one night. A line item referencing property distribution that didn't match what our parents had told us. A gap where there should have been clarity. A signature line that seemed strangely cropped, as though the original had been replaced. A mild irregularity, I told myself at first. An oversight. A clerical error. Anything but what my instincts whispered in the quiet of that dimly lit room: something is wrong. The longer I stared at the paperwork, the more that whisper grew teeth. It wasn't confusion tightening my chest, it was recognition. A warning, faint but insistent, echoing from years of watching Daniel shape truth into whatever served him best. I didn't know then that the missing page was the first loose thread in a much larger unraveling. But I felt it. Deep enough that I couldn't ignore it. The morning after I found the missing page, I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief distorts perception, it makes ordinary details loom like threats. That was the reasonable explanation. But when I returned to the estate files, reasonable explanations began to evaporate. Paperwork that should have been straightforward, property deeds, appraisal forms, probate correspondence, felt strangely disjointed, as though the story they were telling had been edited mid-sentence. Dates that should have aligned didn't. One signature of my mother's leaned unnaturally to the left, as if someone unfamiliar with her handwriting had tried to reproduce it. Another document bore my father's signature in ink that looked too fresh, too bold, for something supposedly signed years before his death. I would lift a page, compare it to another, then to another, each inconsistency a small tremor in the ground beneath me. These weren't gaps I could explain away with a misplaced stapler or a distracted clerk. They felt intentional, like someone had carefully rearranged events to obscure a truth I wasn't meant to find. Daniel, when I approached him, was sunlight, warm, bright, blinding. He laughed when I asked about the strange dates. "You're overthinking, Lucy," he said, using that gentle, older brother tone meant to soothe. "Probate is messy. Half the paperwork gets rewritten 3 times. Don't get lost in the details." His charm had worked on so many people throughout our lives: teachers, employers, girlfriends who always left believing the breakup was their fault. But in that moment, it struck me how effortlessly he wielded charm as a shield. A distraction. A curtain drawn across a door he didn't want opened. I pressed again, mentioning the signature that didn't look right. His smile tightened, barely, but enough for me to see the fracture. "Mom signed things differently when she was sick," he said quickly. "You know that." Except I didn't know that. And he knew I didn't. When I asked to see the original files, the ones he claimed were stored in a safety deposit box, he suddenly had somewhere to be. A meeting. An errand. A phone call he forgot to make. Every excuse delivered with polished ease, but threaded with something new, avoidance. By the third day of his evasions, the atmosphere shifted. The house felt different. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Heavy in a way that suggested something was being concealed within its walls. So I did the only thing that made sense. I began documenting everything: dates, conversations, discrepancies. I created folders, labeled with cold precision, suspicious signatures, irregular timelines, missing pages. Every detail felt like a small clue, a breadcrumb in a forest I had never intended to enter. This wasn't an investigation. Not yet. I told myself I was simply being thorough. But the truth hung in the air, silent and undeniable. Something darker was unfolding right in front of me. Something orchestrated. Something personal. And I was only beginning to see its outline. I went to the county records office on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning that seems to dim the world on purpose, as if preparing you for what you're about to learn. I told myself it was just a routine check, a way to quiet the unease that had grown too persistent to ignore. I expected clerical clarification. Maybe a misplaced file. Something harmless. Instead, I found the truth. The records clerk was a soft-spoken woman with silver hair and the sort of calm presence that makes people confess things. She typed my mother's name into the system, then my father's, scrolling through property documents with a practiced hand. Everything appeared normal, at first. Then her brows creased. She murmured, tapping the screen. That's odd. My pulse sharpened. What is? She turned the monitor slightly, not enough for me to read everything, but enough for me to see a line that shouldn't have existed. A transfer of ownership. A sale date. A buyer's signature. A piece of our inheritance, the lake cabin, the place where my mother used to hang wet towels over porch rails and my father taught us to swim, had been sold. Quietly. Completely. Without my signature. Without my knowledge. The clerk clicked on the deed. Looks like the transaction was finalized about 6 weeks ago, she said. Both heirs signed off on this. At least, the documents say they did. Both heirs. Both. I stared at the signature beside Daniel's. My name, written in an imitation so clumsy it almost felt insulting. The loops were too rounded. The slant was wrong. Whoever forged it didn't know that I always pressed harder on the final letters, or that my Y dips lower on bad days. My breath felt thin. This isn't my signature, I said. My voice sounded distant, someone else's voice, coming from somewhere behind me. The clerk's eyes softened in a way I recognized instantly, the look people give when they witness the moment someone realizes a truth that cannot be undone. Her tone was careful. You may want to speak with an attorney. As I walked out into the gray morning, the world felt tilted. Cars passed, people chatted on sidewalks, a delivery truck rumbled over a pothole, life continuing as if my own had not just split cleanly down the middle. I felt grief, yes, but it was a strange, electric grief, sharper, colder, tinged with something darker. A grief not for what was lost, but for what had been taken. And I knew, instantly, painfully, that this was no clerical mistake, no miscommunication. This had been orchestrated. Planned. Timed for when I was most vulnerable. Daniel had waited for the funeral dust to settle, for my exhaustion to weigh me down, and then he had moved swiftly, quietly, like a man who'd rehearsed the betrayal long before carrying it out. I stood beside my car, keys trembling in my hand, as a truth settled over me with the force of winter. My brother didn't just betray me. He erased me. He counted on me never discovering it. I went to the county records office on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning that seems to dim the world on purpose, as if preparing you for what you're about to learn. I told myself it was just a routine check, a way to quiet the unease that had grown too persistent to ignore. I expected clerical clarification. Maybe a misplaced file. Something harmless. Instead, I found the truth. The records clerk was a soft-spoken woman with silver hair and the sort of calm presence that makes people confess things. She typed my mother's name into the system, then my father's, scrolling through property documents with a practiced hand. Everything appeared normal, at first. Then her brows creased. She murmured, tapping the screen. That's odd. My pulse sharpened. What is? She turned the monitor slightly, not enough for me to read everything, but enough for me to see a line that shouldn't have existed. A transfer of ownership. A sale date. A buyer's signature. A piece of our inheritance, the lake cabin, the place where my mother used to hang wet towels over porch rails and my father taught us to swim, had been sold. Quietly. Completely. Without my signature. Without my knowledge. The clerk clicked on the deed. Looks like the transaction was finalized about 6 weeks ago, she said. Both heirs signed off on this. At least, the documents say they did. Both heirs. Both. I stared at the signature beside Daniel's. My name, written in an imitation so clumsy it almost felt insulting. The loops were too rounded. The slant was wrong. Whoever forged it didn't know that I always pressed harder on the final letters, or that my Y dips lower on bad days. My breath felt thin. This isn't my signature, I said. My voice sounded distant, someone else's voice, coming from somewhere behind me. The clerk's eyes softened in a way I recognized instantly, the look people give when they witness the moment someone realizes a truth that cannot be undone. Her tone was careful. You may want to speak with an attorney. As I walked out into the gray morning, the world felt tilted. Cars passed, people chatted on sidewalks, a delivery truck rumbled over a pothole, life continuing as if my own had not just split cleanly down the middle. I felt grief, yes, but it was a strange, electric grief, sharper, colder, tinged with something darker. A grief not for what was lost, but for what had been taken. And I knew, instantly, painfully, that this was no clerical mistake, no miscommunication. This had been orchestrated. Planned. Timed for when I was most vulnerable. Daniel had waited for the funeral dust to settle, for my exhaustion to weigh me down, and then he had moved swiftly, quietly, like a man who'd rehearsed the betrayal long before carrying it out. I stood beside my car, keys trembling in my hand, as a truth settled over me with the force of winter. My brother didn't just betray me. He erased me. He counted on me never discovering it. Confronting Daniel felt inevitable, like stepping into a storm you've watched forming on the horizon for too long. Every instinct told me to brace myself. Every memory reminded me who he was, who he had always been beneath the polished surface. But nothing prepared me for the moment I finally knocked on his door. He opened it wearing that familiar, easy smile. The same smile he used on teachers when caught cheating, on girlfriends when explaining away late-night messages, on our mother when she asked why money kept going missing from her purse. But now, it seemed thinner. Pulled taut. Fragile. Lucy, he said, stepping aside. Didn't expect you. I know, I replied. You never do when the truth is coming. Something flickered in his eyes, not guilt, not yet, but recognition. He knew I knew. We sat in the living room, though neither of us truly sat. Our bodies occupied the chairs, but our minds remained standing, tense and alert, waiting for the first blow. The silence settled heavy between us, thick enough to taste. I went to the county records office, I said. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Okay. They showed me the deed transfer. The sale of the lake cabin. His gaze drifted to the window, as if the world outside might supply him with a response. It was necessary, he said finally, each word clipped. The estate needed liquidity. You didn't tell me, I said. You didn't ask. You forged my signature. That's not true. It is, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And the documents prove it. For a moment, his expression cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough for me to see something raw beneath it. Not remorse. Not even fear. Desperation. You were grieving, he said sharply. You weren't capable of handling complex decisions. I did what needed to be done. You stole from me, I said. From us. From the people our parents raised us to be. His composure faltered. You always needed protection, he snapped. You were too emotional. Too trusting. I handled things because you never could. The words were meant to wound. Instead, they revealed everything. The mask he'd perfected for decades, of the capable older brother, the charming fixer, began to crumble. I saw the person beneath, a man who believed he was owed more, entitled to more, deserving of what wasn't his simply because he wanted it. When I told him I had hired an attorney, the blood drained from his face. "You're going to ruin this family," he whispered. "No," I said. "You already did." The tension that filled the room felt electric, vibrating at the frequency of something breaking, something that had cracked long ago but was only now shattering out loud. He stood abruptly, pacing, muttering half-formed explanations that contradicted themselves. One moment he blamed financial stress, the next he insisted the sale was legal, the next he claimed I had agreed verbally. The lies tangled around him like tightening ropes. And somewhere between his shifting stories and rising panic, the collapse began. Not of the case. Of him. This confrontation didn't solve anything. It only solidified what came next. Court was no longer a possibility. It was the only path left. The courthouse was colder than I expected, an architectural monolith of stone, glass, and echoes. People often imagine courtrooms as noisy battlegrounds, but in reality, the quiet does more damage. It amplifies fear. It forces truth to stand naked beneath fluorescent lights. Daniel sat several feet away from me, his expression strangely neutral, as if he were simply waiting for a routine appointment. But his fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, an unconscious tremor revealing everything the rest of him tried to conceal. I didn't look at him for long. There was nothing left to recognize. When the proceedings began, the courtroom transformed into a stage where every secret my brother buried clawed its way to the surface. The handwriting expert was the first to testify. A man with silver-framed glasses and steady hands, he carried an air of precision that made the room lean in. He placed enlarged versions of the signatures on an easel, my real one, and the ones Daniel had forged. The differences were subtle at first glance, but glaring under scrutiny. The forger attempted to mimic the natural slant, he explained, tapping the exhibit with a thin metal pointer, but failed to replicate the pressure patterns consistently. "These are deliberate imitations, not genuine signatures." Each word felt like a scalpel cutting through the last of Daniel's defenses. Next came the financial analyst, who chronicled the timeline of the property sale. The speed at which the documents were processed was, in his words, highly irregular and suggestive of concealed intent. Transfers routed through secondary accounts. Funds dispersed before legal waiting periods expired. Each revelation was another dagger laid before the court. Detectives followed, providing testimony built from interviews, document trails, and statements from individuals involved, some knowingly, some unknowingly, in Daniel's scheme. One detective, a woman with a voice too steady to be anything but seasoned, placed a thick folder on the evidence table. "These affidavits," she said, opening the file, "contain notarizations invalid for several reasons, expired seals, mismatched county jurisdictions, and false witness names. All tied to the defendant." The judge listened without visible reaction, but the energy in the room shifted, quietly, unmistakably, against my brother. As witness after witness took the stand, Daniel's composure deteriorated. He whispered frantically to his attorney. He shook his head at the evidence. At one point, he even glanced back at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, fear, anger, or some mixture brewed from a lifetime of entitlement. But nothing could stop the momentum now. The truth had its own gravity. When the closing statements ended, the silence was suffocating. I felt my heart thudding in my chest as the judge delivered the verdict, slow, deliberate, each word a chisel striking the statue Daniel had carved of himself. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of forging legal documents. Guilty of unlawful property transfer. By the time the gavel fell, the betrayal felt larger than the courtroom, larger than the estate, larger than us. It had become mythic in scale, ancient in its cruelty, modern in its execution. The truth had stripped Daniel bare. And justice, cold, precise, unblinking, finally had its say. The courthouse steps felt steeper walking down than they ever had walking up. Verdict in hand, justice technically served, I expected some sense of triumph, something bright or victorious to break through the gray sky hanging low above the city. But justice is rarely triumphant. It is a slow, deliberate wait that settles quietly, without celebration. People lingered outside, their voices blending with the distant hum of traffic. I stood still for a long moment, trying to trace where the fracture in my life had begun. Maybe it was long before the forged signatures, long before the documents, maybe even long before our parents died. Maybe Daniel's betrayal didn't start with a cabin sold behind my back, but with a boy who learned early that deception could be rewarded. The property was returned to me. The accounts restored. The judgment was clear. Yet none of it felt like winning. In the days that followed, the relief came in small doses, an exhale I didn't know I'd been holding, a single night's sleep uninterrupted by nightmares of courtroom whispers and clattering evidence binders. But grief came too, shadowing the edges of everything. Grief for my parents, who never imagined their eldest child capable of dismantling the family legacy they worked their whole lives to build. Grief for the brother I thought I had, whether he ever existed or was simply a fiction I wanted to believe in. I visited the lake cabin shortly after the verdict, walking through rooms still smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight like suspended memories. I could almost hear my father's laughter on the shore, my mother humming inside the kitchen with the screen door rattling gently behind her. The property stood unchanged, yet everything about it felt irrevocably different. I wasn't just reclaiming a physical place, I was reclaiming a piece of myself I didn't realize I had lost. But even there, in the quiet I once found comforting, the weight of what had happened followed me. Justice had restored the deed, yes. But nothing in the world could restore the trust that had been severed, cleanly and decisively, like a rope cut from both ends. People asked if I planned to forgive Daniel. Some said forgiveness was necessary for healing. Others claimed blood was reason enough to mend what had been broken. But standing in the doorway of that cabin, hearing only the wind against the water, I knew the truth: some wounds close, but they do not heal. Some people remain family in name only. Daniel was sentenced, his future narrowed by the consequences he alone crafted. I didn't attend the final hearing. I didn't want to see the man he became, or perhaps the man he had always been, now stripped of every mask. Instead, I stayed at the cabin, listening to the soft groan of old wood and the distant call of birds settling into dusk. A somber reminder that justice, when it arrives, does not erase the darkness that came before it. It only illuminates it long enough for us to walk away. And as night fell across the water, one truth settled with it. The law had returned what was mine. But it could never return the brother I once believed in.